Imagine a world where the fate of a nation could be changed by one woman's ability, or inability, to bear a child. Now, picture this woman caught in the heart of a powerful monarchy, living under the intense pressure to fulfill a king's desperate need for a male heir. This is the story of Anne Boleyn, one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in English history. Anne Boleyn's journey to the throne of England is nothing short of remarkable. Born into an ambitious family, Anne's early years were spent in the courts of Europe, honing her skills in diplomacy and courtly behavior. But it was her return to England in the early 1520s that set her on a collision course with destiny. Anne wasn't content to simply be another mistress in the king's long list of conquests. She had her eyes set on something much grander. And it wasn't just love that propelled her. It was ambition, power, and the allure of becoming a queen. At the time, Henry VIII was already a powerful and charismatic king, but he was facing a deep crisis. He had been married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, for over 2 decades, but she had failed to give him a male heir, something that was crucial to the survival of the Tudor dynasty. Henry's obsession with having a son was not merely personal, it was political. Without a male heir, the throne could be claimed by someone else, and the dynasty he'd worked so hard to build could be lost. Enter Anne Boleyn. She didn't just catch Henry's eye, she captivated him. Her charm, intelligence, and unyielding refusal to become his mistress set her apart from every other woman he had known. Henry's infatuation with Anne quickly grew into a full-fledged obsession. But Anne wasn't like the others. She wasn't going to settle for anything less than marriage, and so began the infamous split with the Catholic Church. In order to marry Anne, Henry VIII was willing to defy centuries of tradition, creating the Church of England. This move would forever alter the religious landscape of Europe, as Henry broke away from the authority of the Pope, all for a woman. Anne's coronation as queen in 1533 was a triumph, a dramatic and bold moment in history. But it was also the beginning of a turbulent and tragic chapter. Because no sooner had Anne taken her place as Henry's second wife than the pressure began to mount, the pressure to provide him with a son. Now, Anne Boleyn wasn't just fighting to be loved, she was fighting to secure her position, her legacy, and her very life. As a queen, her primary duty was to bear the king a male heir. The stakes couldn't have been higher. She had to deliver, not just for Henry, but for the future of the entire kingdom. And yet, fate had other plans. Anne's first pregnancy, which began with such hope, ended in the birth of Elizabeth, a girl. Though Elizabeth would go on to become one of the most powerful monarchs in history, at that moment, she was seen as a disappointment. And with that disappointment began the unraveling of Anne's position in the court. Henry's desire for a son only grew stronger, and Anne's failure to deliver that heir planted the seeds of her eventual downfall. As the days passed, Anne found herself caught in the whirlwind of political maneuvering, court gossip, and her own struggle to hold on to Henry's affections. Little did she know that the very thing that had made her queen, the king's desperate need for a son, would ultimately lead to her undoing. So, what is the price of ambition? And when does a queen, once at the top of the world, find herself at the mercy of the very power that elevated her? In the case of Anne Boleyn, the answer is both tragic and unforgettable. Let's step back into history for a moment. The year is 1525, and Henry VIII, the King of England, is at a crossroads. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, has borne him a daughter, Mary, but no male heirs. In a monarchy where the survival of the dynasty depends on a son, this is an issue that cannot be ignored. Henry is desperate. He's in his prime, ruling an empire, yet facing the fear of seeing his bloodline slip away. This is where Anne Boleyn enters the picture. Unbeknownst to her, she's about to change the course of history forever. Anne was a sharp-witted, beautiful, and ambitious woman. Raised in the courts of Europe, she was well-versed in diplomacy, charm, and the ways of the elite. When she returned to England, Anne quickly captured the attention of King Henry VIII. But here's the twist. Anne didn't want to be just another mistress. She didn't want to live in the shadows like Henry's previous lovers. No, she wanted the crown, and she wasn't going to settle for anything less. And this refusal to be a mere mistress became the spark that set off an entire political and religious firestorm. You see, Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years. But there was a problem. Catherine had failed to give him a male heir. In a world where dynasties were built on the promise of sons, this was a threat to Henry's reign and the future of the Tudor dynasty. Henry, desperate for a son, became obsessed with Anne Boleyn. But Anne wasn't just willing to be another pawn in his quest for a male heir. She made it clear she would only marry him. Now imagine the stakes. This wasn't just about love or lust. This was about securing a future for the throne of England. So, Henry made an unprecedented decision. He was willing to break with centuries of tradition, and yes, break with the Roman Catholic Church itself. In 1534, Henry VIII created the Church of England, severing ties with the Pope and the Catholic Church, all to marry Anne. That's right, Anne Boleyn was the catalyst for one of the most significant shifts in Western history. But all of this wasn't just to get a woman on the throne. Henry was doing this for a male heir. He was fighting for the survival of the Tudor dynasty. And Anne, for all her charm and ambition, was caught in the crosshairs of that very same struggle. In 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England. But what should have been a moment of victory, a coronation marking her rise to the highest position a woman could achieve, was soon overshadowed by a pressing question: could Anne Boleyn deliver the one thing that could make or break her future? Could she give Henry the son he so desperately needed? Enter Anne's first pregnancy. The entire kingdom held its breath, waiting for the arrival of a male heir. The promise of a son hung in the air, and Anne was fully aware of the stakes. A boy would secure her place on the throne, solidify her marriage to Henry, and, most importantly, secure her future. After all, how could she ever be truly safe in a world where kings had absolute power, and where a failure to deliver a male heir could mean ruin? The birth of Elizabeth I in 1533 was a bittersweet moment for Anne. Elizabeth was beautiful, intelligent, and destined to become one of the most powerful monarchs in history. But to Henry, she was a disappointment. She was a girl. She was not the son he had dreamed of. You can almost feel the weight of that moment, the moment when Henry, for all his power and influence, must have felt his hopes of securing the Tudor line slip further out of reach. Henry VIII was a man defined by his ambition, his hunger for power, and perhaps most tragically, his need for a male heir. To him, Elizabeth's birth wasn't a triumph, it was a failure. It wasn't what he needed. And in a world where kings were only as good as their heirs, Anne's failure to deliver a son began to sow the seeds of tension between them. But here's where things get complicated. Anne Boleyn was not just a passive player in this story. She was a woman with her own dreams and ambitions. She was smart, resilient, and unwilling to let her fate be dictated by the whims of the king. Yes, she failed to give Henry the son he wanted, but Anne's legacy wasn't just tied to her ability to bear children. Anne's intelligence, her political maneuvering, and her role in shifting the very fabric of English society were far more enduring than the birth of any child. However, at that time, Anne's worth was directly tied to her ability to provide a son. The fact that she had given birth to a daughter instead of the son Henry longed for made her position more precarious by the day. So, what happens when the king's obsession with a male heir becomes an all-consuming force? What happens when a woman, bound by her duty to provide that heir, fails? Well, Anne Boleyn's story teaches us just how fragile power can be. Her triumph as Queen of England was fleeting. The crown she had fought so hard for would soon slip from her grasp. Now, I want to ask you, how far are you willing to go for the things you desire? Would you risk everything, your very identity, for the pursuit of something that may not even come to pass? Anne Boleyn did. But in the end, she became the queen who had everything and lost it all. A woman defined by ambition, love, and the painful weight of history. So, stick with me, because Anne's story is far from over, and it's about to take a dark turn that you won't want to miss. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had once captured the heart of a king, was now facing a crushing weight that would forever alter her fate. That weight was not only the crown she wore, but the constant pressure to bear a son. In an era where male heirs were considered the bedrock of a dynasty, Anne's failure to deliver a son would become her greatest struggle. Imagine the immense pressure Anne must have felt. When she first caught the eye of King Henry VIII, she had been full of hope. Their passionate affair had led to a break from the Roman Catholic Church, a historic rift that saw England become its own Protestant nation. But now, with the crown of England on her head, Anne's position was no longer secure. Her greatest responsibility was clear: to provide a male heir. Every royal pregnancy, every tiny flutter of life within her womb was met with public scrutiny. The kingdom, the court, and even her enemies were watching. Anne's failure to bear a son, time after time, turned the whispers of the court into something far more dangerous: rumors. Political pressure was mounting, and with each failed pregnancy, the whispers grew louder. They spoke of her failure, of her inability to fulfill Henry's most basic wish, an heir to the throne. Anne was not just fighting for her child, she was fighting for her very place at the king's side. The longer she failed, the more her reputation crumbled. From a queen to a disappointment, the once celebrated Anne now found herself constantly under the microscope. Her position was no longer secure, her future uncertain. But even in the face of these overwhelming odds, Anne did not give up. Her second pregnancy in 1536 was her last hope, a chance to finally provide Henry with the son he so desperately needed. Anne held on to that dream. She believed, perhaps more than ever, that this time would be different. This time, she would give Henry the child he had always wanted. In the early months of 1536, Anne's hopes soared. The pregnancy seemed promising, but just as quickly as it had come, that hope shattered. She miscarried. The child, a boy, was lost. The dream of a son, of securing her place and legacy, slipped through her fingers like sand. For Henry, this loss was the final blow. His infatuation with Anne, once so consuming, began to wane. It wasn't just the miscarriage. No, it was the fact that Anne had failed him in the one area that mattered most. As Anne's future grew darker, Henry's attention turned elsewhere, to a woman who could provide him with what Anne had not, Jane Seymour. A new flame had ignited in Henry's heart, a flame that threatened to destroy Anne once and for all. The court, once full of admiration for Anne, now buzzed with the reality of her downfall. Her enemies grew bolder, and Henry's growing infatuation with Jane Seymour only heightened the tension. The writing was on the wall. Anne's days as queen were numbered. Anne Boleyn's story is a tragic reminder of the fragile nature of power, of how quickly the tides can turn. She had once been the most powerful woman in England, but her inability to deliver the one thing that Henry wanted most would lead to her ultimate undoing. It's easy to judge Anne from the distance of history, but imagine, just for a moment, the immense weight of the expectations placed on her shoulders. A woman who defied tradition, who risked everything for love, but in the end, could not give the one thing that would secure her future: an heir. Her struggles, her heartbreak, and her eventual fall from grace are a testament to the ruthless world she inhabited, a world where the stakes were not just personal, but political. In the court of Henry VIII, loyalty and love. If you've been following Anne Boleyn's journey so far, you know she reached the pinnacle of power, crowned Queen of England in 1533, after years of struggle and defiance. But as quickly as Anne rose to the top, her world came crashing down. In a game of power, survival, and ruthless ambition, nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever as secure as it seemed. Anne's story is not just one of ambition and love. It's a tale of how, in the volatile and treacherous court of Henry VIII, the very thing that elevated her could also be the thing that led to her destruction. The pressure to deliver a male heir, the political intrigues, and the courtly alliances were all like ticking time bombs waiting to go off. And in 1536, they did. Anne was no stranger to political enemies. She had made quite a few in her short time as queen. Her sharp intellect, her refusal to back down, and her influence over Henry VIII made her a powerful woman. But in the Tudor court, power was a double-edged sword. The very men and women who had once supported her now saw her as a threat. And among those waiting to see her downfall was Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's right-hand man. Cromwell was a master of political maneuvering. He had been instrumental in Henry's break from the Catholic Church and his marriage to Anne. But as Anne's failure to produce a male heir became clearer, Cromwell saw an opportunity. Cromwell knew the king's frustrations, and he also knew that Anne had lost her once unwavering favor in Henry's eyes. Her failure to deliver a son made her position untenable. Cromwell, who had long been working behind the scenes to solidify his own power, orchestrated a plot to bring Anne down. He was willing to do whatever it took, no matter the cost, and that cost was Anne's life. Anne's arrest came swiftly, and it was based on accusations so shocking they left the court in disbelief. Adultery, incest, and treason, these were the charges leveled against her. But here's the kicker: the evidence was almost certainly fabricated. These were political charges, not real crimes. She had enemies, yes, but this was a game of survival. Anne was painted as a villain in a court where the truth didn't matter. The very thing that once made her so admired, her intelligence, her ambition, her ability to command the king's attention, was now her undoing. The game of power had turned against her. Imagine the horror of Anne's arrest. She had been the queen, the woman who had defied the Catholic Church, the woman who had married the King of England, all for a dream of providing the Tudor dynasty with a male heir. Now, she was being dragged through the mud, accused of the most heinous acts. It was a brutal reminder of how quickly fortunes could change in the dangerous world of Tudor politics. Anne was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and her trial was a farce. The charges against her were absurd, yet the verdict was swift. She was found guilty of adultery, incest, and treason, crimes she almost certainly did not commit. There was no real evidence, only the will of a king desperate to move on from her. Anne's life had become expendable, a casualty of the ruthless games of power and betrayal. The trial was a spectacle. A woman who had once been the Queen of England, now reduced to nothing more than a pawn in a political game. The charge of treason alone carried the death penalty, but Anne's fate was sealed when the court decided that she was guilty. The king's desire to marry Jane Seymour, a woman who might provide the son he so desperately wanted, was already pushing him to take drastic action. And on May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn's life came to a tragic and brutal end. She was executed by beheading, a stark and final end for a woman who had once been the most powerful queen in England. The scene of her execution was macabre. A crowd of onlookers watched as Anne, poised and dignified until the very end, walked to her death. She had once been the most adored woman in the kingdom, and now she was just another casualty in the bloody game of Tudor politics. But Anne's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it had far-reaching political implications. Henry VIII wasted no time. Just days after Anne's execution, he married Jane Seymour, his third wife, hoping that she would be the one to give him the son he so desperately desired. The very woman who had been vilified for not producing a son was replaced by another woman with the same goal: to give Henry a male heir. The aftermath of Anne's execution was a turning point in English history. Her death solidified Henry's control over the throne, but it also marked the beginning of the end for the influence of powerful women in the court. Henry's desperate need for a male heir became even more urgent, and as we know, Jane Seymour would eventually give him that longed-for son, Edward VI, who would inherit the throne after Henry's death. But let's pause for a moment and ask, what does Anne's tragic story really tell us? It's a story about ambition, power, and the price of failure. Anne's life and death were shaped by forces beyond her control, by the demands of a king who saw her not as a partner, but as a means to an end. And when that end wasn't achieved, her life became expendable. Anne Boleyn was a woman ahead of her time, a queen who broke boundaries, defied the church, and fought for her place in history. Yet, in the end, she was ultimately a victim of the very system that had once elevated her. Her story is a haunting reminder of how fragile power can be, especially when it's tied to something as uncontrollable as producing an heir. So, let me leave you with this thought. In a world where power and ambition often drive people to the brink, how much are we willing to sacrifice to keep it? And more importantly, what happens when we fail? Anne's story may have ended in tragedy, but it's a cautionary tale for anyone who believes that the pursuit of power is without consequence. We often remember Anne Boleyn for the dramatic rise and fall of her life, her sharp intelligence, her defiance, her ambition. But as we look back on her story, we realize that what she left behind wasn't just a tale of personal tragedy. Anne Boleyn's legacy is intertwined with the very fabric of English history, shaping the future of a nation and a monarchy in ways no one could have imagined. Anne's most enduring legacy, without a doubt, is the daughter she gave birth to in 1533, Elizabeth I. While Anne's life was tragically cut short, her daughter would go on to become one of the greatest and most successful monarchs in England's history. Elizabeth I wasn't just a ruler, she was a symbol of resilience, intelligence, and power. Her reign, known as the Elizabethan era, would bring England into its golden age, shaping the arts, exploration, and the expansion of the British Empire. Think about it for a moment. Anne's downfall, the pain of losing her position, and the tragic end she faced, it all ultimately led to the rise of Elizabeth. The very thing that cost Anne her life, a daughter instead of a son, became the cornerstone of England's future. In a sense, Anne's failure to meet Henry's desperate need for a male heir paved the way for a ruler who would become one of the most influential women in a world history. Elizabeth's success made Anne's sacrifice seem even more poignant, because in the end, Anne gave the world a queen who would shape the future of an empire. But beyond Elizabeth's triumph, Anne's death had a lasting impact on the English monarchy itself. Henry's desire for a male heir continued to dominate the rest of his marriages, but in the aftermath of Anne's execution, there was a shift. Her execution showed the brutal price of ambition in a world where power, particularly the power of women, was so fragile. Anne's legacy, in many ways, serves as a warning. If a woman as strong, intelligent, and ambitious as Anne Boleyn could be so quickly discarded when she failed to meet the king's expectations, what did that say about the value of women in a patriarchal society? Anne became a symbol of the dangers women faced in the Tudor era, especially when their worth was determined by their ability to produce male heirs. She was seen as a woman who had everything and lost it all for a single reason. She didn't give Henry the son he wanted. The truth, however, is far more complex. Anne's life and death reflect a larger pattern in history, how women's power was often tethered to their reproductive capabilities. For Anne, it was the tragic result of failing to meet the expectation of a male heir, which ultimately led to her tragic end. But let's step back for a moment and think about the larger picture. What does Anne's story really tell us about the intersection of gender and power? In the Tudor world, as in many parts of history, women were often valued for their ability to bear children, specifically male heirs. This societal expectation was not just about fulfilling a role in the family, but about securing the future of a dynasty. It's a harsh reality, but one that shaped the fate of many women throughout history, and Anne was no exception. Her tragic fate is a stark example of how, during that time, a woman's value was often reduced to her ability to bear a son. But Anne's story isn't just about the limits placed on women. It's also about how women, despite these limitations, managed to carve out their own places in history. Anne, with her intelligence, wit, and fierce determination, defied convention and became one of the most powerful women in Europe. She was an agent of change, even if the system around her was bent on tearing her down. Anne's downfall also forces us to ask a difficult question. How much does society still tie a woman's worth to her ability to meet expectations? Today, we might not face the same pressures as Anne did, but the legacy of her story still resonates. Women are still often judged by their roles as mothers, wives, and caregivers. Anne Boleyn's legacy is a reminder that women, historically, have had to navigate complex power dynamics, often at great personal cost. Her life invites us to reflect on how far we've come and how far we still have to go in terms of equality and opportunity. But there's also something else we should recognize: Anne's defiance. Despite the tragic end to her story, Anne Boleyn stood for something. She refused to be just another mistress. She demanded marriage, and when Henry was desperate enough to break from the Catholic Church to marry her, she became a queen. She fought for her place in history, even if it ultimately led to her downfall. Her ambition wasn't just about gaining power for the sake of it. It was about asserting her right to control her own fate, to be more than just an object of desire for a king. And in that defiance, Anne left behind a lesson. She may have failed to deliver the male heir Henry so desperately wanted, but she paved the way for Elizabeth I, one of the most powerful women in history. Anne may not have had the opportunity to see her daughter's reign, but she planted the seeds for a dynasty that would change the world. So, when we think of Anne Boleyn, we shouldn't just remember her as the queen who lost her head. We should remember her as the woman who defied the odds, and whose legacy, though tragic, left an indelible mark on history. So, I ask you, what do we take from Anne's story today? It's a story of ambition, power, and sacrifice. It's a story that forces us to reckon with the way women are valued and the cost of failing to meet societal expectations. But it's also a story of resilience, of a woman who dared to dream of something more, even if it ultimately led to her downfall. Anne Boleyn may have lost everything, but her legacy lives on, not just in history, but in the very ideals of ambition and strength that continue to inspire generations. Anne Boleyn's story is one of the most poignant and tragic in all of English history. A woman with ambition, intelligence, and charm, she defied the odds, broke with tradition, and captured the heart of a king. Yet, despite all she accomplished and all she became, her life was cut short in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. How does someone who once stood at the very top of the world, with power, influence, and the future of a nation in her hands, fall so swiftly and tragically? Anne's life was a reflection of the unforgiving nature of the time she lived in. She was caught in the tangled web of politics, power, and the relentless pressure to fulfill expectations. Her ambition to be more than just a mistress, to be a queen and a mother to a male heir, was both her strength and her downfall. For a time, Anne was at the pinnacle of power. She had the king's ear, she had the crown, and she had the world watching her every move. But her failure to provide the one thing that Henry VIII needed, a male heir, became the undoing of her life. In the unforgiving world of the Tudor court, where power was everything and women's worth was often reduced to their ability to produce heirs, Anne's inability to deliver a son cost her everything. And yet, despite the tragic end to her story, Anne Boleyn's legacy would live on. It didn't live on through her death, but through her daughter, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was born from the very marriage that had brought Anne to the throne, and her reign would go on to change the course of English history forever. Elizabeth's leadership, strength, and wisdom would establish her as one of the most formidable monarchs to ever rule England. In a sense, Anne's sacrifice, the very thing that led to her tragic end, paved the way for Elizabeth's rise. The seeds of the Tudor dynasty were sown in Anne's ambition, in her dream of a strong, prosperous England, and in the bloodline she carried, even if she did not live to see it flourish. Anne's death, though brutal, was a pivotal moment in history. It not only marked the end of her life, but also the beginning of the reign of a new era in England. It was her marriage to Henry, her break from the Catholic Church, and her eventual execution that set the stage for the creation of the Church of England. This was a monumental shift, one that would alter the religious landscape of Europe for generations. Anne, whether knowingly or unknowingly, had helped to ignite the fires of religious reform. And while her death may have been the result of political maneuvering and royal disappointment, it also laid the foundation for a Protestant England. But let's pause for a moment and reflect on something profound. Anne Boleyn's legacy isn't just about what she did or didn't do in her lifetime. It's about the role women played in shaping history during a time when they were often seen as little more than tools for securing alliances or producing heirs. Anne was more than that. She was an intellectual, a strategist, and a visionary. Even though her power was precarious and ultimately fleeting, Anne's influence stretched far beyond her years. In the wake of her tragic end, her story became one of the most compelling in history. It was a tale of ambition, betrayal, and the price of power. Anne Boleyn's story continues to captivate us today because it reflects universal themes: ambition, the fight for recognition, the dangers of failure, and the complexity of a human nature. Her life and death invite us to question the roles that power and gender play in shaping our fates. How often do we see people, especially women, whose potential is either stifled or celebrated based on factors beyond their control? Anne's story serves as a mirror to these questions, urging us to reflect on the barriers that still exist today. The fascination with Anne's life, and especially her tragic fate, has endured for centuries. She remains an enigmatic figure, a woman who dared to challenge the rules, only to pay the ultimate price. But her story is more than just a cautionary tale. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest legacies are not those we intend to leave behind, but those that unfold long after we're gone. Elizabeth I, Anne's daughter, carried Anne's legacy forward in a way no one could have predicted, proving that even in the darkest moments, something powerful can be born. Anne Boleyn's tragic fate was the result of many factors: a king's obsession, a nation's demands, and a court's ruthless power games. But out of that tragedy came a legacy that no one could have foreseen. Anne's influence extended far beyond her own lifetime, shaping the future of England, the Protestant faith, and the role of women in power. And in the end, Anne's place in history is not just as the queen who lost her head, but as a woman whose ambition and resilience left a mark that would echo through history for centuries to come. So, as we look back on Anne Boleyn's life, we must ask ourselves, what can we learn from her story? How does her legacy shape the way we view ambition, power, and the role of women in today's world? Anne may have lost her life at the hands of a ruthless king, but in the end, she gave birth to a queen who would change the world. And through Elizabeth, Anne's voice continues to echo, proving that sometimes the greatest legacies are the ones that endure long after we're gone.